Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Wilson, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my work on analyzing temporal relationships between trending terms on Twitter and activity on Urban Dictionary. But first, I want to acknowledge my co-authors. This work couldn't have been done without them, and I'm really thankful for all of their help on this project. So to begin, let's take a look at some of the major social media platforms that people are using for research purposes to learn about what people are interested in, what people are talking about. And what we know is that these conversations aren't happening in isolation. There's this interconnectivity between the different platforms that we can think of as an information ecosystem. So, for example, you might browse Reddit, find a link to a video which was posted on YouTube, and then decide to share that link on Twitter. You may become interested in specific content or ideas. So perhaps you learn on Facebook that an event has happened and decide to go check for pictures of that event on Instagram, and so on. Users may move freely between these different platforms, and previous studies have really looked into how this happens through the sharing of information, memes, links, news, and other types of content. However, there's another platform we are interested in looking into a bit more. So some previous work has looked at Urban Dictionary itself to start to understand what's happening on this platform, but no previous work has looked into how Urban Dictionary activity is linked with this larger ecosystem. So we're going to do that today, specifically by starting with trying to identify a link between the activity that happens on Urban Dictionary and activity that we see happening on Twitter. But before we talk about how we did that, let's talk a little bit about what Urban Dictionary is. So it is a dictionary. It's online, about 2 decades old, where anyone can upload a definition for any term, really, any word or phrase. And you may find definitions for things like short abbreviations describing types of things people might say when communicating on the internet. We see definitions for slang terms, some newly emerging terms that often reflect recent situations. And some of these terms are actually legitimate in the sense that people are trying to give a helpful definition for what something means in their own words. On the other hand, some of the definitions are purposefully incorrect, often in an attempt to be humorous. And in addition to these, we often see other types of offensive and inappropriate content, which I won't show here for now. So an individual entry on Urban Dictionary looks like this. We have the head word itself, which can also be a phrase, like we see in this example. We have the definition given by the user. We also can have one or more usage examples where people show how you might use this in conversation. We have tags also assigned by the author who created this entry. We have the username of the author, the date when this new definition for the term was created. We also have information about the votes, so you can see how many times other users have liked or disliked this particular definition for this head word. And of interest for us in this study is this activity information that we have from Urban Dictionary, which gives us some idea about how often people are accessing the page and trying to learn about what this means potentially. The scale of this is unknown, but we still use the overall trend level information to learn about relative importance over time of particular words. Okay. So why might we expect that Urban Dictionary activity is not happening in a vacuum and that it somehow reflects larger cultural events or conversations happening elsewhere? As a really simple example, we start by just looking at definitions of, for example, George W. Bush. This graph shows the number of new definitions that occurred on each day over this period. And these are then aggregated by month. So if we also compare the time period where George W. Bush was the president of the United States, we can clearly see that a large amount of the activity around definition creation happened during his term as president. And if we look at other recent United States presidents, we see a similar trend, especially with a large increase in new definitions being created during the campaigning and leading up to the beginning of these presidents' terms. So based on this little bit of evidence, we want to take a deeper look into what's happening on Urban Dictionary and also try to connect it to what we see happening on larger conversations on mainstream platforms like Twitter. So the main research questions that we're going to look at in this study are: is the activity on Urban Dictionary correlated with discussions on Twitter that are happening during the same time period? And if this is true, for which kinds of words and phrases? Finally, we want to ask, for a given word, are new Urban Dictionary entries created more often while that word is trending on Twitter? So what's the data that we're going to use to try to answer these questions? So we collect the entirety of Urban Dictionary through October 2019. Here's some information about the data that we collected. We have about 5.6 million entries, 2 million unique words, and we can also see a distribution over the number of definitions per word. So you can see that most words just have one definition. However, there are some words with over 1,000 definitions for that single word. This graph shows the length of the definitions, where we see a similar trend, a lot of short definitions and some extremely long definitions. And we can also take a look at the distribution of upvotes and downvotes assigned to posts. Okay, so for our study, we're not actually going to look at every single word on Urban Dictionary because we really want to find the set that is going to have some kind of interaction with Twitter and that we can perform the kinds of analyses that we want to do on the temporal information. So we use some criteria to filter our set of words of interest. So of course, these words should be those that are defined on Urban Dictionary. And then we check to make sure that these words have appeared at least 10,000 times in our Twitter sample that we collect, which comes from a 1% sample of tweets between the beginning of 2012 and just before October 2019, which is when we have collected our Urban Dictionary up through. And we also want terms that have at least 1 year's worth of Urban Dictionary activity data. So this activity data is not available for every term. So we're really going to focus on the ones for which we do have this data so we can do the comparisons that we want to. And after this filtering, we have about 32,000 terms that we examine. This is the distribution over the number of terms and how many times they appear on Twitter. So to recap the data for each Urban Dictionary definition that we have, for each entry, we have information about the definition creation. We have the page view activity for that term. And we also have the Twitter activity, which is just the number of times that tweets have mentioned this term, have used this term or phrase in them. And we aggregate all of our data across a month level. So now that we have the data, we can move to our research questions that we outlined before. The first one, so is activity on Urban Dictionary correlated with discussions on Twitter during the same time period? Okay, and another element of this is we were interested in whether or not Twitter activity seems to trail the activity on Urban Dictionary. So do activities happen on Urban Dictionary, then on Twitter later in a following month, or vice versa? So to get at both of these questions, we're going to compute the cross correlation between the two time series. So if you imagine that these two lines represent the activity for Twitter and Urban Dictionary, and t equals 0 is the true offset between these, what we can do is slide one across the other and compute the correlation value at each time step t. So you could imagine t equals 1 may look like this, t equals 2 may look like this. And again, t here is measured in months. So when t is positive, then we can see that the blue line may be trailing the red line. And if t is negative, then the opposite may be true. And this gives us some kind of information about which time series seems to be leading the other one. So we can compute this for all of our terms of interest that we have and see how often Urban Dictionary data trails Twitter, how often they seem to be in sync, where the activity is happening in the same month at the point where the highest correlation happens, and where Twitter trails Urban Dictionary. So here on the x-axis, you can see the correlation score. So this is the highest correlation that we found when doing this sliding window. And we only consider the range from -3 to +3, assuming any lag over that amount is just going to lead to spurious correlations. And we also may have some false positive identification of events here. As you can see, there are some correlations that are really close to 0. So we also do filtering to look for just those that we expect to be significant, controlling for the false discovery rate. And this is what's left. So you can see we've removed a lot of the correlations that are very close to 0. And a majority of the remaining correlations are positive correlations. And there are still some negative ones at the same time. But we can see that for a number of terms, there is a significant correlation between the activity on Urban Dictionary and Twitter. So now that we've identified that, we want to ask, for which kinds of words and phrases do we see these correlation patterns? So let's look at some specific examples. First, I want to look at Pokemon Go. This was one of the highest correlations that we identified in our data set. Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game for mobile platforms. And it was released in 2016, where you see this huge spike in activity on both Twitter and Urban Dictionary at the same time. And this gives us this really high correlation value at an offset of 0. Other terms that we don't expect to be very correlated, we don't see much of anything interesting, but this is just to show kind of a control case where we pick something like guacamole. The offset isn't really that important because we weren't able to identify any kind of significant correlation. And this is the kind of thing that would have been filtered out when we are removing the examples that are most likely to give us errors when we do the controlling for statistical significance. Third, this example shows a negative correlation between Twitter and Urban Dictionary activity. This is Naruto. It's a Japanese manga series. And what we see is Urban Dictionary data starts to decrease in around 2017, while Twitter data starts to increase. And this actually coincides with the end of one of the final episodes of the final seasons of this show. So before I move on, I want to give a warning that the next slide contains some potentially offensive, it's explicit content. This is just due to the nature of the data. We are now going to show some of the top terms from different categories, and this is how the data came out from our analysis. So here you can see some of the most positively correlated and negatively correlated terms between Twitter data and Urban Dictionary data. So on the left, we see a lot of memes, cultural events, things that may have happened at a certain time point, and we get extremely high correlation scores for these, where the activity on both platforms is happening at the same time. So if you're unfamiliar with some of these, I would encourage you to look them up on Urban Dictionary and you can learn more. For the negatively correlated terms, we actually see a lot more offensive and inappropriate content. These are the ones that we saw opposite trends on the two platforms. I would not encourage you to look these ones up. Looking at a tag level, we can see a similar kind of trend where the tags assigned to the most positively correlated terms are often also indicating some relationship to events happening in the world, cultural trends, politics, memes, things like that. Whereas on the right, we also see more tags related to inappropriate and offensive content. Another angle that we can look at this from is how Urban Dictionary specific the terms are that we're looking at by comparing them with a more standard dictionary. So we use Wiktionary for our reference dictionary, and we take the words in our set that we're interested in, our roughly 32,000 Urban Dictionary terms of interest, and we check how many of them also have definitions in Wiktionary. And what we can see is actually for the terms that have a positive correlation between their Urban Dictionary activity and Twitter activity, relatively smaller number of them are defined in Wiktionary compared to those who are negatively correlated or for those for which we see no significant correlation. So this suggests to us that the positively correlated terms are more Urban Dictionary specific terms that may be including more slang, more non-standard terms, and these are the ones that actually track most closely between the two platforms. And finally, we move to answer our third research question. So for a given word, are new Urban Dictionary entries created more often while that same word is trending on Twitter? And for that matter, while that word is trending on Urban Dictionary. So to do trending term detection, we start by taking a activity trend line. This can be Twitter or Urban Dictionary activity. Here we see the Twitter trend line for the term vibing. We run change point detection to identify points along this time series where the overall trend significantly changes. And then we fit a piecewise linear function over this and compute the slope over each piece. If the slope exceeds a certain threshold, then we identify that point in time as a trending period for that term. And so you can see it in this example, those highlighted portions are where the term is identified as being trending. So what we're actually looking for is when the word is experiencing a big increase in usage, rather than specifically just looking for spikes or high points. We're looking for where this term is really starting to become hot and people are using it more at a rapid rate. And these are the times that we may expect new people are starting to see this term and may either be looking it up on Urban Dictionary or creating new definitions to help others understand this term that's starting to gain more interest at that time. So we can compute how many new definitions are created on Urban Dictionary for this term during the trending periods and during the non-trending periods. And what we see is that the probability of a new definition being created during a trending period is significantly higher than a new definition being created during a non-trending period. And we can define trending again in terms of Twitter activity or Urban Dictionary activity. And we see the same trend for both. We can also look at the converse and we see that the probability that a term is trending is higher given that we've seen a new definition for that term in the same month than if we haven't seen a new definition for that term. So to conclude, looking back at our original research questions, we've seen that activity on Urban Dictionary is correlated with discussions that happen on Twitter during the same time period. And in general, the Urban Dictionary specific political and cultural terms are the ones that are positively correlated. That is, their activity on Urban Dictionary and Twitter is positively correlated, whereas inappropriate and offensive terms are negatively correlated more often. And we've also seen that for a given word, New Urban Dictionary entries are more likely to be created while that word is trending on Twitter or Urban Dictionary. Thanks for your time and for watching this video. I hope to hear from you if you have any comments or questions, and I appreciate your interest. Thanks.